In August 1986, on the first day of first grade, 6-year-old Eloise Taylor walked into her brand new elementary school. She felt excited to be around all these people her own age. She'd been looking forward to meeting her classmates all summer and couldn't wait to make friends. She got in line with all the other kids in her class and followed her new teacher, Miss Brody, down the hall to their classroom. Miss Brody gave Eloise the desk right at the front of the room, and Eloise was determined to be her best student. She began unpacking her school supplies, then sat at her desk and turned around to say hello to the girl right behind her. But when she did, that girl just wrinkled her nose and made a face, like Eloise had done something wrong. She turned her back to Eloise and started whispering to other classmates. Eloise was confused, but she didn't have time to dwell on it, because Miss Brody called for attention and began passing out a worksheet. First day of school had officially begun. Eloise listened intently as Miss Brody began her lesson, and she figured Miss Brody must have noticed how well she was paying attention, because during the lesson, Miss Brody kept pausing to look over at Eloise. Eloise sat up a little straighter, confident she was making a great first impression. And so she wasn't surprised when Miss Brody tapped her on the shoulder right after lunch and asked her to join her in the hallway. She figured she was going to tell her what a good job she was doing. But once they were in the hallway, Miss Brody crouched down and asked her if she had taken a bath the night before. Eloise was confused, but nodded and said yes. Miss Brody just pursed her lips, like she wasn't sure if Eloise was actually telling her the truth. She asked Eloise a few more questions about her hygiene, like if she bathed every night, how many times a day she brushed her teeth, that sort of thing. Eloise did her best to answer, feeling more and more like she was in trouble for something, except she couldn't understand what she'd done wrong. As soon as they went back into the classroom, Miss Brody announced that they were all going to move desks. She'd made a new seating chart during lunch. Eloise dutifully emptied out her desk and waited as Miss Brody gave out the new seating assignments. She called Eloise last, and she put her all the way in the back corner of the classroom, right by an open window. Eloise felt like the whole class was staring at her as she shoved her books into her new desk. As soon as she sat down, the kid right in front of her began inching his desk forward, like he was trying to put space between them. Eloise didn't understand why nobody in her class wanted to be near her, so for the rest of the day, she just kept to herself. When the final bell rang at 2 p.m., Eloise shoved her homework into her backpack as her classmates began filing out of the class. Some of the boys passed by her desk on their way out the door, and each one of them whispered "fish" as they walked by. Eloise didn't really know what they meant, but her face still went red hot. She tried to linger behind the rest of the class as they all walked to the parking lot to wait for their parents. But one of the girls turned around and told Eloise out loud that she smelled like manure. Then a couple of boys started chanting dead fish," over and over again. Eloise immediately burst into tears. Luckily, she saw her dad's car right at the front of the pickup line, and so she sprinted right over to it. She climbed into the passenger seat and told her dad what happened, that her new classmates hated her. Her dad let out a long, apologetic sigh, almost like he'd been expecting this. Then he told Eloise that for some reason, ever since she was little, she would occasionally start smelling like fish. Her doctors had no idea why this was happening. It was just something she was born with. Eloise was stunned. She wanted to know why her parents had never told her about this. But her dad didn't have a good answer. He just said that they didn't want her to worry about it before it became a problem. Eloise was quiet for the rest of the ride home. She couldn't smell this fish odor herself, but clearly it was strong enough to stink up her entire classroom. And now she had no idea how she was going to go back to school and face the same ridicule every day. Over the next several years, Eloise tried to keep to herself, but some of her classmates still bullied her. And when she entered middle school, the bullying only got worse. One afternoon in 6th grade, Eloise was headed to class when a couple of 8th graders cornered her in the cafeteria. They threw tuna fish sandwiches at her and laughed about how bad she smelled. Their taunting drew a crowd, and suddenly the whole hallway seemed to be laughing at her. Eloise tried hard not to cry, but holding back the tears took so much concentration that she didn't have the energy to fight back or walk away. she just stood there, taking the ridicule, until the school librarian stepped in and told everyone to go to class. The librarian shielded Eloise until the hallway cleared out. Then she invited her to clean up in the bathroom and come have lunch in the library. Eloise nodded, her whole body shaking with adrenaline. She couldn't take the bullying anymore. She had to figure out what was causing the fish odor and find a way to make it stop. From that day on, Eloise ate lunch in the library. Though there were no computers in the school at the time, the librarian helped Eloise comb through the school's collection of encyclopedias and other textbooks to try to find a cure. However, 2 years later, by the time Eloise graduated 8th grade, she hadn't found anything. And doctors weren't able to help either. Nobody was able to figure out why Eloise smelled so bad. Eight years later, around 2003, Eloise sat down at her workstation at the local bank. She was newly graduated from college and working on her master's degree in education. Her dream was to become a teacher, but in the meantime, she had gotten a job as a bank teller. Eloise sprayed herself with the perfume she kept in her bottom drawer, then logged into her computer. She quickly got so absorbed in her work that she didn't notice her supervisor walking up to her desk. He tapped on her shoulder and told her to pack up her things and follow him. He had some new responsibilities for her. Eloise smiled, but she had a sinking feeling in her stomach. She followed her supervisor to the very back of the bank, to an isolated room with a big window. He told her she was going to be the drive-through bank teller from now on. Eloise knew the real reason she had been moved here. She felt defeated. This was like first grade all over again, and she got moved to the back of the class on day one. A moment later, she could hear the soft hiss of a Lysol spray bottle down the hallway, and she knew that some of her colleagues must be spraying down her old workstation with air freshener. Eloise knew her fishy odor would eventually become a problem at work, even though she showered multiple times a day and constantly coated herself with perfume. The odor was just too overpowering. She couldn't blame her coworkers for not wanting to be around her. Eloise's odor was the reason she didn't have any friends, and it made her feel like she was a burden to her family. She didn't let herself get close to anyone. She'd tried dating someone recently who promised he was okay with her smell, but she worried that he'd eventually get sick of it, so she actually ended things before he could. And now, she sat on the metal stool in front of the bank's drive-through window and tried not to take it personally when her supervisor shut the door on his way out. She knew there was no escaping her odor, but she was beginning to realize what that truly meant for the rest of her life. If she didn't find a way to mask it or control it, this would be her future. Complete isolation as she watched the world pass her by. The following year, in the fall of 2004, Eloise moved through her new classroom, opening up windows and setting up a few strategically placed fans. A few months earlier, Eloise had finally finished her master's in education and got a job teaching middle school. She hoped that, as a teacher, she could make life better for any kids who faced bullying, like she had all through school. She was still nervous about her odor, but she had a plan. If the windows stayed open, and she could keep air blowing at her, nobody would notice the fish smell. This would work, she thought. It had to. Soon, her class filed in, and she began with the day's lesson. She kept checking over her shoulder, but nobody was making a face or sniffing the air. Everyone was bent over their desks, hard at work. She couldn't help but feel excited. It was working. Nobody could smell her. The following morning, Eloise doused herself in perfume, then got to school early to spray the classroom with air freshener and turn on the fans. And that day, once again, nobody mentioned a fish smell. By the time the lunch bell rang, she was overjoyed. Finally, after more than 2 decades of dealing with her odor, she'd found a way to mask it. Once Eloise's classroom had cleared out, she walked around with the Lysol can again, and then headed over to the teacher's lounge. It was just across the hall from the cafeteria, so the teachers could usually hear their students talking while they waited in line for lunch. Eloise sat down at a table near the door and began to unpack her lunch bag. And as she did, she heard a few students talking about their summer breaks and their new classmates. Then, she heard a student say he had the new teacher, Miss Fishy. The students around him laughed and said they knew exactly what he was talking about. That afternoon, Eloise couldn't focus on her lesson. She kept stumbling over her words or forgetting what she was writing on the chalkboard. All she could think about was whether she was filling the classroom with that pungent, reeking smell. Every noise a student made felt like a stifled laugh at her expense. She was so stressed out that when she finally got into her car after school, she just broke down and cried. Over the years, Eloise had seen countless specialists about her condition, and she'd continued to do her own research, even while she was studying all the time for her master's degree. But nothing helped. She felt trapped and utterly defeated. She'd spent most of her childhood crying on the way home from school, and now it appeared like she might spend the rest of her career the same way too. For the rest of the week, Eloise was so preoccupied by her smell that she could barely teach. Then it got even worse on Friday when her fish odor stank up the entire auditorium during a school assembly. She was a laughingstock and was so discouraged that she just couldn't continue like this. Before she left school on Friday afternoon, she headed to the principal's office and resigned. A month later, Eloise sat on her couch feeling down. A random sitcom rerun was playing on her television, but she wasn't paying any attention to it. She was on her computer, scrolling mindlessly through a website with comedy videos. Eloise hadn't used the internet very much until she started her master's program, since the internet was still a newer technology. But now she was making up for lost time. Lately, she would spend hours on different comedy sites, trying to distract herself from what a freak she felt like. For the past few weeks, Eloise had been thinking more and more about suicide. She had no friends, she didn't feel like she had a future. She couldn't even bring herself to look for another job. She was at rock bottom. She clicked on another comedy video, wishing she were tired enough to go to sleep. And that's when she saw an advertisement at the bottom of a webpage for a site called Ask Jeeves, which was one of the leading search engines in the early days of the internet. You could ask a digital butler named Jeeves any question, and he would comb the internet for answers. Eloise was intrigued. She clicked on the banner and then typed into the search bar, "fishy body odor." After hitting return, she didn't expect much. But then, a couple of links began popping up. Eloise bolted upright as she clicked on the top result. It brought her to a website that described an extremely rare condition called trimethylamminuria, or TMAU for short, although apparently it was more commonly known as fish odor syndrome. It's a metabolic disorder where the body can't break down a smelly chemical called trimethylamine. The body produces the chemical when a person eats certain foods like bread, beans, eggs, and of course fish. And because people like Eloise can't break down this chemical, it builds up in their system and seeps into their lungs, saliva, sweat, and other bodily fluids, causing a pungent smell that comes from inside. When Eloise discovered this, there were only 600 documented cases of the syndrome in the entire world, and so Eloise became number 601. After some more searching, Eloise found an online community of people living with this rare condition. They helped her learn how to manage her odor by changing her diet and taking daily supplements like chlorophyll, which may help reduce inflammation in the body. Eloise also met a doctor who understood fish odor syndrome, and they helped her find the best perfumes and deodorants to help mask the smell. And surprisingly, these steps she was taking as a result of this community worked. People stopped making fun of Eloise, and slowly she became confident enough to have friends and go out socially. After nearly 30 years of struggling with this putrid smell, Eloise found a way to lead a mostly normal life. She ultimately went back to teaching, determined to create a special curriculum for students who were different in any way, to make sure that nobody suffered the same kind of ridicule that she did. In late April 2013, 38-year-old Alejandra Soto was in her kitchen loading up a tray with Gatorade, a bowl of soup, a package of throat lozenges, and an inhaler. Upstairs, she could hear her 11-year-old daughter, Maggie, coughing in her bedroom. Her cough sounded bad, but it was a vast improvement compared to the past few days. Maggie had come down with a severe case of bronchitis, a condition that develops when the airway to the lungs becomes inflamed, causing a persistent cough. Alejandra had taken the week off from her demanding office job to take care of her daughter. She knew there'd be an avalanche of emails waiting for her when she got back to work, but her daughter's health came first, and she did not want to take any chances. Back when Maggie was a baby, she developed a severe case of pneumonia and almost died. Ever since, Alejandra had been incredibly cautious anytime Maggie developed any kind of respiratory illness. Thankfully, though, Maggie did seem to be recovering from this latest bout of bronchitis. She'd been on medication for the last 4 days and seemed to now have more energy and strength too. Alejandra hoped that in another few days, the bronchitis would disappear completely. As Alejandra grabbed the tray of supplies for her daughter off the kitchen counter, her phone lit up. It was more calls from clients that she was missing. She took a calming breath and reminded herself that in a few days she'd be back at work. Then she could put in some overtime to catch up, and everything would go back to normal. A few weeks later, in mid-May, Alejandra was setting the kitchen table for dinner while Maggie sat at the far end doing her homework. And at some point, Maggie just started coughing, and she was coughing so hard that her face turned beet red. Instinctively, Maggie reached for her inhaler, which she had been prescribed back in April for her bronchitis, and she breathed in the medication. And right away, her cough quieted down, and so she went back to work. But just minutes later, Maggie started coughing again. As Maggie took another puff from her inhaler, Alejandra rushed over and began rubbing her daughter's back, trying not to show how concerned she was. 2 weeks earlier, Alejandra had thought Maggie was getting better, and so she sent her to school. However, just a few days ago, Maggie had developed this dry cough. Now, Maggie had said she felt fine, but she was actually coughing more now than she had been before. Alejandra had taken her to the doctor's office for an exam, but the pediatrician just said to keep using her inhaler. The cough would clear up with time. Except, now it seemed like Maggie's cough was only getting worse. And so Alejandra sat down next to her daughter at the table and told her that it might be time for another doctor's visit. She'd see if the pediatrician could squeeze them in tomorrow, and then maybe afterwards they could grab some ice cream. Maggie said she liked the sound of that, and then she got up to help her mother bring dinner to the table. The following day, Alejandra sat in the pediatrician's office, ignoring the constant buzz of emails on her phone, while the doctor examined Maggie. He listened to her lungs with a stethoscope and told Maggie to breathe in deeply, and as she did, she exploded into a coughing fit. The pediatrician was sure that Maggie's bronchitis had cleared up. He told Alejandra that her daughter could be having some kind of allergic reaction, like hay fever. And so she wanted Alejandra to try over-the-counter allergy medications and see if maybe that alleviated the cough. On the way home, the mother and daughter grabbed some allergy medication from the pharmacy, along with some ice cream cones from the ice cream shop, as promised. Maggie took the allergy meds with some water in between licks of her cone, and within a few minutes, her cough seemed to be getting a bit better. Alejandra hoped that maybe now this would be the end of her coughing fits, and by tomorrow morning, they could go back to their usual routines. A month later, Alejandra sat inside of a dimly lit acupuncture spa that smelled like incense. Her daughter Maggie was lying on a massage table in the center of the room, looking completely calm as an acupuncturist pressed thin needles into her forehead. Alejandra tried not to flinch as she watched. She was very squeamish about needles and was impressed by how little they seemed to bother Maggie. In fact, this was the calmest Maggie had looked in weeks. She wasn't coughing at all. Generally, Maggie's cough had gotten drastically worse. Most of the time, she was coughing about every 4 seconds. She coughed all day long from the time she woke up to the moment she fell asleep. Somehow, Maggie could sleep through the night without coughing, but the rest of the time, she coughed incessantly. Maggie also said that her nose, throat, and stomach all hurt, which only made sense to Alejandra. She estimated that Maggie was coughing more than 10,000 times a day. Alejandra was genuinely scared for Maggie's health, and so at this point, she was basically willing to try anything to help her daughter. And since Western medicine did not seem to be solving Maggie's cough, Alejandra had decided to try something different: acupuncture. And so far, the acupuncture appeared to be working. Maggie's cough went away while the acupuncturist placed the needles around her body. Alejandra had no idea why this treatment seemed to work when so many others had failed, but she was not about to question it. After the acupuncturist had finished applying all the needles, they slowly began to take them back out again. She had Maggie breathe in deeply and sit upright as she worked. Alejandra felt relieved. They'd actually found a treatment that seemed to work. However, after all the needles were out and Maggie got off the table, she immediately began to cough. 2.5 months after that, Alejandra sat in a hospital examination room, watching a neurologist test her daughter's coordination skills. The doctor had Maggie mimic his movements as he balanced on each foot and tapped his nose and did a few dance moves. Maggie laughed in between coughs as she followed his choreography. It was clear the doctor was good at working with kids, and Alejandra was grateful for that because it had been a long day. They'd been at the hospital since that morning, putting Maggie through a battery of physical exams, lab tests, and imaging scans. The doctors wanted to explore every possibility because at this point, Maggie was coughing an average of over 15,000 times a day. Alejandra did her best to put on a brave face in front of her daughter, but inside, she was a mess. For sure, she was terrified that something mysterious and potentially deadly was making her daughter ill, but Alejandra had to admit that she was also very stressed about all the work she'd been missing to make all of these doctor's appointments. Eventually, she would have to clock a lot of extra hours just to catch up, which meant more time away from Maggie. Now, she would do anything for her daughter, but physically and emotionally, she was reaching a breaking point. At some point, the neurologist told Maggie to have a seat, and then he bent over his clipboard to scribble a few notes. Alejandra held her breath, hoping the doctor would have some kind of news. But instead, he said there was nothing wrong with Maggie's coordination skills. However, the neurologist said he had a theory about what might be wrong with her. There was one last specialist he wanted Maggie to go see. A week later, Dr. Daniela Vega took notes while her new patient, Maggie, sat at the kid-sized table in her office, coughing away as she worked on a puzzle. Dr. Vega was a psychologist, and Maggie had been referred to her office by the neurologist at the hospital. Dr. Vega asked Maggie to describe her symptoms. Between coughs, Maggie told her that her nose and throat hurt, her stomach ached, and sometimes she got these tingly sensations in her thumbs and pinky finger. She said she coughed all day long, except for when she was sleeping or receiving acupuncture treatments. Dr. Vega made a few notes while Maggie continued to cough and work on her puzzle. But just a moment later, Maggie clearly stopped doing her puzzle and let out a huff like she was bored with the puzzle and with this appointment. Dr. Vega asked a few follow-up questions, but now Maggie's answers were short. There was an edge of annoyance in her voice. But to Dr. Vega, it made sense. Maggie had been to so many doctors at this point, she'd very likely answered all these questions dozens of times, yet still she was coughing. As Dr. Vega watched Maggie cough, she noticed she had a little routine. Maggie would scratch her nose, then squint, and then cough. Every few seconds, she'd scratch, squint, cough, over and over like clockwork. Dr. Vega made a note of it. Then the doctor put her clipboard down and asked Maggie what kind of music she listened to and what her friends were like at school. Maggie looked surprised, but she started telling Dr. Vega all about her classmates, her favorite subjects at school, and what she wanted to be when she grew up. Suddenly, Maggie was animated and engaged, and seemed to love how intently Dr. Vega was listening to her. And while she was talking, Maggie barely coughed. Dr. Vega scribbled down a few more notes on her clipboard, and thanked Maggie for sharing so much with her. Then she led Maggie back out to the waiting room, where her mother was busy typing out emails on her phone. Alejandra stuffed her phone into her bag and rushed over to her daughter to ask how it went. Maggie very eagerly told her mother all about how she and Dr. Vega had talked about school and all the different things going on in her life and how fun the appointment was. And then after that, Dr. Vega asked them to wait for just a few minutes while she ducked into her office. She just wanted to reread Maggie's case file to make sure that the hunch she was forming was correct. Once she was back in her office, Dr. Vega pulled up Maggie's medical history. Specifically, she wanted to read the section about Maggie's case of pneumonia when she was only 18 months old. Dr. Vega suspected that there was nothing physically wrong with Maggie. Rather, her persistent cough was actually a vocal tic, a completely psychological phenomenon. The conversation she had just had with Maggie about her friends and about school and what she wanted to be when she grew up tipped off the psychologist. When Maggie was talking about things that interested her, she coughed less. The cough also disappeared completely when she slept, which would not necessarily happen if this cough was caused by an infection. But, perhaps most importantly, Maggie didn't seem worried about her cough or about trying to get better. It was almost like she subconsciously knew that she wasn't actually really sick. Dr. Vega suspected that part of what brought on this tic was Maggie's severe case of pneumonia when she was a toddler. When she was ill, her mother, Alejandra, had slowed down and paid way more attention to her. And then ever since, anytime Maggie had a cough or flu-like symptoms, once again, her mother would be extra attentive. Dr. Vega was pretty sure that subconsciously, Maggie was coughing to get attention from her mother, who seemed to be constantly overloaded with her work. And so while Maggie's cough was actually real, in the sense that she really did feel this need to cough, the underlying reason for it was not physical. It was all in her head. Once Dr. Vega delivered this diagnosis, Maggie was treated with a low dose of an antipsychotic, as well as daily talk therapy that included breathing and muscle control exercises. After only a week of treatment, Maggie's cough rate decreased from almost 1,000 coughs an hour to just about 40. Then her doctors decided to try her on a different antipsychotic, and after only 12 days on it, Maggie stopped coughing altogether. 2018, James and Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the U.S. Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes' drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs, with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike, or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house and she gets her husband, she brings James back and he looks inside, he's just as shocked as she is, and the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror, and she was applying eyeliner, and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it, and she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons. But again, there's silence. So she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway, and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet, and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her, and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway, or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her, she was sure of it. And so she went back to her room, thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home, and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany, and she got mad at James, and before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, they weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She
She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert, and instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, "I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs." Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying. And Brittany's picking up on this, and so finally she just says, "James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed?" And so James is like, "Yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house." But Brittany was not convinced, and she says, "You know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house." And so Brittany would get out of her bed, she'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway, and as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything, she didn't hear anything, and so very slowly she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything is fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, you are totally overreacting, you're being paranoid, you're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house. And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, you stay right here. And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, you gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening. And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside, and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his two kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay, but the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because, at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, James, were you riding your bike before we left? And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, we've been robbed, and then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, you stay in the car, do not get out. And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house, and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
"This is not your house,"
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight, he would be arrested, and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom, and then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family. Meaning, the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death, allegedly. Although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family, or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called Omnivore Trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown.